Welcome everyone again. We're thrilled to have you join us today for this important conversation about creating inclusive workplaces for neurodiverse employees. We'll be exploring best practices and policies to foster a truly accessible and inclusive workplace. I'm Kai Keane, co-founder and chief product officer here at Disclo. I would be described as a half Japanese, half white man with a big beard in a maroon colored baseball cap that says Disclo on it, wearing a dark green button-up shirt. And today I'm in my partner's studio, which has lots of shelves and baskets behind me. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about Disclo in a minute here. But really, our company's vision is a world where no one has to choose between their health and their work. And today, I know that supporting employees with neurodiversity is a topic that is top of mind for many HR and ER folks, like some of you joining us here today. So who better to have join us in this conversation than Susanne Bruyere, who is the academic director of the Yang Tang Institute on Employment and Disability at Cornell University's Industrial and Labor Relations School. It's a bit of a mouthful, but an amazing title. And today we'll be covering a lot of ground. We'll start by giving you a quick introduction on Disclo and our vision for inclusive workplaces. Then we'll move on, have Susanne share her insights on her institute, as well as the neurodiversity in the workplace as a topic. We'll have dedicated time at the end to address any questions you may have. And finally, we'll have some closing thoughts from Susanne, as well as mentioning her upcoming course on autism at work. So please stick around for that. Okay. Let's get started with a quick overview of Disclo. At Disclo, we're driven by a simple but powerful mission to create inclusive and accessible workplaces for all. We believe that every individual has the potential to contribute regardless of their disability. We started our journey as a company called Chronically Capable, if you've ever heard of it. We're focused on connecting individuals with disabilities and chronic illnesses with supportive and inclusive employers. But then we've expanded our focus since then to supporting the request process and triaging of ADA and PWFA accommodations. I'm sure everyone in this webinar knows someone or is someone with a disability and can also empathize with how difficult it can be to ask for what you need at work. That's a topic that we'll be covering a lot about today. Well, Disclo is here to help with just that. So we help streamline and standardize the interactive process, medical verifications, and implementing accommodations in both a safe and compliant way. We believe what's usually a really daunting and scary process should be safe, confidential, and efficient for everyone involved, including HR and ER staff like yourselves. And I'm also excited to announce, and this is entirely new, that we just received a grant for our patent. So Disclo is now a patented technology. So please send us a message if you'd like to learn more. Okay. Now on to the main session. I'd love to introduce Susanne a bit more. She is not only a professor of disability studies, but also an influential figure in the field of disability and employment policy. She has an impressive background with a PhD in rehabilitation counseling psychology from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she's led numerous federally funded research projects focused on improving employment outcomes for people with disabilities. Not only that, she has also authored 5 books and more than 180 articles and book chapters on workplace disability inclusion. So without further ado, I'm delighted to invite Susanne Bruyere. Susanne, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Kai. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation to participate this afternoon.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to be have you willing to share your expertise with us today. And I should also mention before we get started that I am also a Cornell alum, and so I'm especially honored to do this webinar with you today.
That's
okay.
Great.
Yeah.
I do like that affiliation.
Yeah, a little disclosure. Okay, let's get started. Speaking of Cornell, on the Institute itself, Susanne, I'll pass on the slides to you.
Okay. And let me start with a self description as well. I am a boomer age woman, white woman with short white hair. I am wearing very bright colors. I love bright colors. An orange jacket, an orange and tan multicolored scarf, matching orangey earrings. And I'm in my Cornell University ILR School Yangtan Institute office on the Ithaca campus. And today's a sunny day, which is great because many months of the year we may not see the sun. So it's terrific.
I remember that.
Yes, yes. So it's a very nice day here today. So a little bit about the Institute. I told you I'm in this context, and the Institute, the ILR School, I'm very proud to say, has had some kind of disability-focused programming since the 1960s. So I was thinking about this very early on. Our institute now has 60 plus team members, close to 70. We are all focused, everything we do is focusing on the full inclusion of people with disabilities in broader civil society, but with a focus on employment. We're an enterprise unit, and by that I mean is that we seek funding to support the initiatives we feel that are really important, mostly from federal funds, also some New York State funding. We conduct a lot of research, and I'll touch a bit on that when we Kai and I are having exchanges, but we take very seriously bringing information to the field. So that's why I'm very excited about these kinds of opportunities to reach more broadly. We see this as a part of our mission. We're a land-grant institution, knowledge translation and diffusion activities. And we're very proud to have a very multidisciplinary team. We have a photo here in a launch of a garden named for a colleague. But this is only a proportion, probably half of our team. But we have data scientists, we have practitioners, we have psychologists, social workers, special educators, statisticians. So to bring the talent we need to bear on the issues that we'll be talking about today, we have a very diverse team of people. So that's a little bit about us, Kai.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I want to move on to our main topic for today, which is really this interest in neurodiversity in the workplace. I have a couple slides for you here.
Yes, well, I think sometimes it's certainly we have a select audience that are joining us here today. You're coming because you believe that this is an important topic, which is terrific. I'm often sometimes pitching to employers why they should be thinking about neurodiversity. And here are some of the things, in case this is useful to those of you who are joining us today. First of all, we do know when we look at the Centers for Disease Control statistics over the last 10 to 20 years that there is an increasing number of neurodiverse individuals that are being identified. The prevalence rates, this is usually conducted on children who are approximately 8 years old, 8 years of age, was 1 in 36 in 2020. These statistics, there's always a little lag. These were released in 2023. So these are our most recent statistics. And that's an increase of over 300% over a 10-year period from this same data collection process by the CDC. And that statistic was children with autism. When you look more broadly and include all the individuals who are considered under this neurodivergent diagnosis, it's approximately 1 in 5 of the general population. So it's a significant proportion of people that we're talking about in the United States and more broadly globally. Yeah. And we do know that, and I'm going to use the autism statistics because we have more documentation on that right now, that is a smaller proportion than this 1 in 5. They're significantly underemployed, and many have difficulty navigating the employment process, which is why we have certainly begun focusing on this to see if we can generalize from other things we've done to be of assistance. And we also do know that when you design your workplace for inclusion of neurodiverse individuals, it does help if you're thoughtful about how you create and structure your employment processes, which is what we want to talk more about today. And
Yeah,
I'll pause
absolutely.
there.
Yeah, that sounds great. Love to talk more about career advancement as well.
Yes, and this is an important topic, Kai, because many people, we often focus on how do we get, which is really important, right? People need to get their foot in the door of employment. And as we just heard, many people are not able to do so. But it is also true that once in the workplace, people can get stalled, particularly if they're people who are different than what supervisors are used to, or they don't know how to be good advocates for themselves. So here are some of the factors that we have found do hinder neurodiverse individuals. It's usually not so much the nature of the neurodiversity itself, which may have been present for a very long time. What is usually more important are some of these other things, and that is the person's own engagement in self-limiting behaviors, such maybe because of lack of confidence, they may choose not to participate in career advancement opportunities. And that's important for us to know as supervisors, because that may mean that they need a little more encouragement, a little extra attention, so that we make sure they don't fall behind unnecessarily. We also know that when people disclose, or even if they haven't disclosed it, but there are obvious characteristics that would signal that they're neurodivergent, that there are stereotypes and stigmas affecting opinions about competence, and that can be limiting to their opportunities for growth and advancement. And also we know that stigmas and stereotypes can build on each other. So if people who are neurodivergent are also members in other historically underrepresented groups, there may be multiple stereotypes or stigmas that are operating for them that might hold them down in advancement opportunities in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll definitely touch on some of these topics shortly. We wanted to share this statistic that might relate to some of the things you just mentioned. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this, Susanne?
Maybe sure. Too. In some of our research, and we've conducted research across a wide variety of stakeholders, but often with HR professionals, because there are hundreds, approximately 1 in every 100 employees, there is an HR professional for. So it's we find a really good litmus on the workplace. And in some of our studies, as well as actually asking individuals with disabilities themselves, whom they disclose to about their disability, particularly if they have a non-obvious disability, right? So they have to disclose to get an accommodation. We find that people are 60% more likely to disclose their disability to their supervisor than HR, either in a formal system, online system, but even before that, just in conversations that it doesn't have to go through an online system. They're much more likely to share with the person that they work with day to day than go into the formalized process to make that initial sharing. That's really important, because lots of times supervisors aren't equipped to deal with that disclosure.
Yes, absolutely. And this is something we see on Disclo's end quite a bit, where the status quo is employees going directly to their, of course, manager or their boss, and they say, hey, I have this condition and I need this accommodation, in a good scenario, right? That's a scenario where you trust your supervisor or manager, or maybe it's gotten so bad that you felt like you were forced to disclose. Now, I want to talk more about that disclosure shortly, because it does have an impact on people's actual lives. But yeah, we talk about this with clients all the time, is to try to have a system where you're not disclosing directly to your manager, but if that were to happen, to bring it to HR, to a proper, more standardized process where ADA experts can help you. So moving on, I'd love to start our discussion here. And thank you for setting the stage, Susanne. Thank you for giving us some background. I wanted to share a few more maybe statistics on this, because I think it's relevant to what we just talked about. There is an amazing neurodivergent influencer on LinkedIn who's very vocal, Margot Jaffe, shout out to her, posted on LinkedIn recently about a study done by understood.org, a nonprofit supporting folks with neurodivergence. And it was a study that was done this year in April with over 2,000 people who said they were diagnosed with maybe something like ADHD, dyslexia, or a different condition that would be considered neurodivergent. And this is one of the key findings. Is nearly 1 in 4 neurodivergent workers said they were either fired or demoted after requesting accommodations. So I want to set the stage here because I think this is such a powerful statistic, especially because this is this year that this is happening. So Susanne, as a first question, I'd love to hear your perspective on why it's essential for workplaces to acknowledge and support neurodiverse employees.
Yeah, well, that is a very unfortunate statistic, and I'll speak to that. I have not read the study, but I think we can just taking it as at face value, say these kinds of things do occur. I think they're more likely to occur in workplace settings where the overarching goal of inclusion has not been articulated. And therefore, there's less understanding about what neurodivergence is alone, but also that this may be a company that is affirmatively wanting to recruit people. We see that in companies that are affirmatively recruiting neurodivergent individuals, and it started with a focus on autism, that setting the stage was critically important, letting everyone in the workforce know what neurodivergence was, and that the company was interested in being more inclusive of people with these characteristics or who identify in this way. That's really important because otherwise supervisors may not know that they have a cohort or an individual of people who might need extra supports, whose requests for accommodations are not only valid, but important for them to be able to be retained and be productive and really contribute their skills. So a lot of it has to do with starting at the top and this articulation of this is a part of our mission as a company. This is your role, Mr. or Ms. Supervisor, in helping us to be inclusive. And here's the resources we're going to have to support you in doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing in the comments now that a couple folks have sort of mentioned that they're finding maybe this is an accurate stat from their sort of empirical evidence. And certainly studies we've done here at Disclo also reflect this, where there just isn't a ton of support, or, sometimes these decisions are made on the managerial supervisor level, and HR doesn't even get involved in some of these types of cases. So it's really a commitment that the entire organization has to make. And it's not just a nice to have, but really it's also a compliance issue, right? I want to touch a little bit more. I want to share maybe one more stat from this study, which is 6 in 10 feel there's a stigma around asking for support. And, I want to bring this up because that is alarming. But from your perspective, Susanne, you've been in the field for a long time. You've seen lots of things change and evolve. Do you think this is a new phenomenon? Do you think anything has changed over the past 30 or so years?
It's certainly not a new phenomenon. I think people who identify as neurodivergent, but people who identify also with other kinds of identities that we've known, there's been discrimination occurring, disability more broadly across a wide variety of different types of disability, gay, lesbian, bi, transsexual, anyone who feels like there may be potential social disapproval. I think unless they have to ask, don't disclose if they have a non-obvious identity that they feel might be discriminated against. I think people are concerned about asking if it is for a reason that's related to something they think might stereotype them or have a stigma attached to it. I think that's not new. I think it's historical. Yeah. I think it is getting better. It is It is sad to hear these statistics because it's obvious it's still out there.
Yeah.
But I think in the last 10 years, we've seen many more employers who do what we just talked about, and that is make a conscious decision for inclusion. And that's what it takes, is people being able to see that the tenor of the climate is inclusive. It makes them feel more comfortable that they can come out, because supervisors and their coworkers have been educated about this as being a part of the values of the organization.
Yeah. And that's a great sort of segue to my next question, which is, you mentioned sort of some best practices or things that employers are incorporating today. Can you tell us a little bit more, share with us some of those practices, maybe policies that they have?
Sure, absolutely. And this, my thoughts, my ideas come from research we've been conducting since the ADA passed in 1990, more broadly around disability, but also what I have observed and information we've been collecting in the last 10 years or so for companies that have been affirmatively recruiting initially autistic individuals, and now more broadly neurodiverse individuals or neurodivergent individuals. And the things that really make a difference, we started talking about, and that is having top level management concerted focus on this. Mm-hmm. There is nothing more, I think, powerful than having top leadership say, this is a part of who we are, and articulate this as a strategic imperative for good business, not for compliance reasons. It also makes a big difference the way the strategy is characterized, that it's not to not get sued. It's not to, it is because it's seen as a talent imperative. Mm-hmm. That's really important to set the stage. And then beyond that, it's readying the workplace more broadly. It is educating supervisors. It is talking about it in general across your workforce. And it's identifying people who have had positive experiences, do identify with the characteristics of neurodivergence, and are willing to talk about their experience, both for the good and things that need to be changed, and creating support systems for individuals by having employee resource groups that allow people to come together and in a safe environment, vet their experiences, vet their thinking, and together coalesce ideas of how to improve the work environment. Having, affirmative hiring programs that give people a different portal to come in, that prepares the accommodation process for neurodivergent individuals. We've had accommodations since the passage of the ADA. So that's 35 years of experience, right? But we have not been focused on neurodivergence historically. Right. So many systems that may be in place, even though they could be terrific for accommodation, just may not be ones that really are as up to speed on what are accommodations for people who have neurodivergent characteristics. Does the employee assistance program know about stress and anxiety for people who are neurodiverse and what their unique experiences might have been in that regard? So all those systems, getting all those systems up to speed before you start an affirmative hiring program, and attending to the people who are already in your workforce and may have been afraid to come forward and disclose, get accommodations, ask for advancements. Getting your place in order is a really important part of being able to be successful in more broadening that kind of a affirmative recruitment hiring process.
Yeah, I have so many questions regarding this topic, but maybe one I'll start with is, can you tell us a little bit more about how these programs differ for the neurodivergent community versus other types of disabilities? Is there something that come to mind when you're thinking about affirmative hiring programs and things like that?
Well, there are both some commonalities, and I think there are some distinctions, some uniqueness. In our broader research about what makes an affirmative hiring program, we found that this is for disability more generally. Mm-hmm. We have found that having targeted internships for people with disabilities may heighten the likelihood of having successfully hired in the last year by 6 times. That was the most influential practice. And I think there's lots of good reasons. And I'm going to say that was for disability, but it applies for neurodivergent affirmative hiring practices as well. And that is because it's a low threat opportunity for the work environment to test talent and to it helps people to, it's great for the individual because, as you heard, the statistics are people don't have a lot of work experience because they have not been successful in being hired, gives them something for their resume, helps them to understand how they can present better in the interview process and in the work environment once there. But it also equally is valuable for the organization because supervisors get a chance to test their ability to be effective supervisors, knowing that this is something that the workplace wants. An internship is a decided employment process or, an initiative that the organization has put in place. So it's time limited, and supervisors also get acculturated in this process as well as giving people experience. That's really valuable. Having relationships with community organizations that can source this talent. We find that that's really important. Having a targeted goal, having neurodiversity as well as disability be a part of your DEI initiative. Often those DEI initiatives do not include these particular cohorts of people or these characteristics. All of those things are really things that help to move the needle and will set the workplace up for success.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually reminds me of another, and I'm sorry, I just keep spitting off statistics here, but I remember reading that Korn Ferry Institute did a research study on DEI initiatives, and that the employers that they saw that had a specific focus on neurodiversity in their DEI efforts have seen an improvement in engagement and performance and even profits, right? So, from our standpoint, and I think the Department of Labor would agree that accommodations aren't just for compliance reasons, but really should be productivity enhancers. It's productivity, they call them productivity boosters, right, on the job accommodation network. I'd love to talk a little bit about that, Susanne, if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing how accommodations not only help of course, employees and job seekers alike, but employers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. First, let me start with a statistic I use often with employers, and that is, I think historically we saw a concern about cost of the accommodations was one of the highest issues early on when the ADA passed.
Yeah,
and we know
still is, I would say. Yeah,
it does. It certainly does come up, although it's, I think recognizing not as much cost in many cases. We know from 35 years of experience, and the job accommodation network, I think, started even before the ADA by 5 years or so. But we know from work that the job accommodation network has done is that most, I'd say 80% of accommodations cost under $500. So, and many of them don't cost anything.
Right.
And we know from national US Census data that 95% in this self-report in our census data, 95% of accommodations are requested by people who do not have disabilities. And because we put the reasonable accommodation language around the ask process, it's become attached to disability. But the reality of it is that people ask for adjustments all the time to accommodate their life and or a health condition that they don't consider a disability. And employers tend to disassociate their general willingness to help people stay engaged and stay productive by tweaking whatever it is they're asking for, and tend to think of reasonable accommodation when attached to disability as more arduous in some ways. So telling employers, reminding them that 95% of their accommodations come from their general workforce, not from people with disabilities, I think is an important place to start.
Interesting. So tell us a little bit about what makes those reasonable accommodations. So, if 95% of employees who don't have disability are requesting accommodations, how should that differ than a normal process of requesting accommodations?
I think it just gets done often under the radar, right? It doesn't get elevated to a medical and I think we're seeing now that many more progressive employers are trying to do that. They're trying to streamline the process. just when they can, just adjust a workspace, adjust a table, adjust a pathway to the and provide equipment that they know, for in the case of neurodiversity, might be easily accessible, like noise canceling headsets, different lights that won't be problematic, noxious smells, extraneous noises. I mean, everybody would benefit from those kinds of changes. So becoming aware of that, creating work environments where people don't have to ask, because it's built in a neurodiversity inclusive design, which benefits more people than just those who are neurodivergent. That's going to be a huge help. And I think many employers are beginning to think that way.
Yeah, definitely. It's that idea, the word accommodations have now, have had this stigma attached, perhaps, that somehow it's attached to a medical condition. But yeah, we do make accommodations and adjustments all the time for our employees. And we don't bat an eye to those types of adjustments made by employees all the time. So it is, maybe in some part is a branding issue. So that's really interesting. I wanted to get a little bit more of the sort of tangible, the everyday scenarios of requesting accommodation to someone who is neurodiverse. I wanted to share another statistic here that most folks, almost half of the people surveyed at understood.org didn't know who to talk to about requesting an accommodation. And we talked about how a lot of folks go to their supervisor or their manager. And so from the employee perspective first, and then, maybe the job seeker's perspective too, who do you think they should go to? What do you think the proper method and structure should be?
Well, I think in a really mature organization, I mean, by mature, I mean one that has been really working to put these processes in place, it's multi-layered, right? I think having some centralized sources to support supervisors and individuals is really important, and it has to be broadly known that it's there. So I think having a point person, having an office, it may be having an accommodation fund that's centralized, so that if the supervisor feels that this is a perceived expense, they have a fallback on that. But I think it's not surprising to me, many supervisors, many individuals have no idea what the accommodation process is.
Right.
And it should be very obvious. We know from doing research about how people with disabilities perceive career pages on company websites, having a very clearly identified accommodation process for the interview process, but also knowing that it's there should they get hired, is something that's an attracting feature for people who are applying, who might know that they might need an accommodation later on. So that centralized process is important. Point person, publicly made very available, but also then at the supervisor level, right? There needs to be an education that if the question comes up, here's who you can help the individual touch base with. Here's who you as a supervisor can touch base with. We have supports to help you figure out what is an alternative that might satisfy the accommodation need. So it needs to be a layered education of the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned job seeker and interview accommodations as well. And I wanted to bring this up because it's one reason why we decided to build out our product Disclo Hire, is that we're starting to see so many more discrimination lawsuits now come from candidates, more than I would have expected from the EEOC, where, you would imagine these complaints and charges are coming from employees usually, but now a lot of candidates aren't getting interviews, or they would stop the interview process. There's retaliation, or there's some sort of end in the interview process once a disclosure has happened. And we want to give folks a safe way to be able to do that. So I feel like that is definitely top of mind for recruiters. Before we get into some questions from the audience, I have a couple questions that I'd love to go through too. Also, a reminder for the audience, feel free to continue asking questions here. I'd love to go through them in the minutes we have left. But maybe just a couple of quick things I'd love to touch on first is I know since COVID, we've seen big changes in why folks request accommodations and what they ask for. And from your perspective, I'd love to hear how has accommodations changed in your field of work and the employers that you speak to? How's that affected the workplace, if at all?
Yeah, it's definitely impacted all of us. I mean, it's been a sea change in how we work, right? So in some cases for the short term, in other cases, very much for the longer term. We know historically many individuals, particularly those who might have stamina issues, would ask employers for the alternative to do flex place. Or reduced hours, but more flex place kinds of things, and had a very hard time getting approval for that. There was a strong sense that everyone needed to be in the workplace. And also, those people who we also heard from those people who were successful getting remote work, flex place approvals, that they felt often left out after they had done that they felt that they were missing the team building, but also advancement opportunities because they weren't regularly visible in the office. That's changing a lot. For one thing, employers can't say it's not possible in many cases now because we did it. We did it under exigency, but we did it. And we created systems and processes to make it work. Yeah. So in many cases, we are seeing employers are allowing more flexibility, not just for people with disabilities, but more broadly for their workforce. And people with disabilities, especially those who may have stamina or transportation issues, are benefiting from that, including neurodivergent individuals. So it has changed our understanding of what's possible in terms of flexible and virtual remote workplaces, but also it's pushed the needle on IT platforms. The digital platforms that really weren't pushed previously, or at least not sufficiently pushed to make changes, had to pivot quickly to accommodate many different kinds of diversities in the pandemic. And those changes are sustaining. They may slow in the response rate of companies, but we've been put on and notice, right, that we really have to have captioning. We have to do a lot of things we were not automatically doing as the providers of virtual platforms. And that had to change, and it had to change quickly. So those are very positive changes for the future.
Yeah, that's really great. And so speaking of positive change, I wanted to share one of the comments that we just received from Harry from Goodwill of North Georgia. He just shared that budgeting for accommodations is a pathway for organizations to support their teams. And maybe this is one way employers have changed a little bit, is including a bit of a budget for accommodations. Do you have any thoughts on that, Susanne, that you could share?
Yes, absolutely. I think, one always hears that a centralized accommodation fund is the way to go. And I think certainly it's helpful to have that buffer so departments know they have that backup. But I also would say, I'm glad Harry brought this up, because I think we also, as supervisors, should be thinking that that's a natural part of good business, right? Is figuring out how we support at the department level. Because I think then supervisors, then teams own that as a part of what they do to help keep their own team members whole and able to be productive. So it's really, I think, budgetary considerations at both levels is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and changes so much of the conversation just to have it as a line item, right? That's understood across the organization. So absolutely. So thank you so much, Harry, for this comment as well. There's so many good comments. I want to go through all of them, but I will read through a little bit now. In the meantime, sort of going from the sort of budgetary conversations, just the last thought on any success stories or case studies you could share with us, without necessarily naming any names, examples you could share with us, models good behavior these days.
Well, the first thing I will do, Kai, is say that there are, we worked with 5 or 6 of the initial champions 10 years ago. And I just want to confirm to our participants today, there is so much broader interest now. And I would send you to Disability In's roundtable on neurodiversity. If you just Google that, you will find them. I think there's close to 50 different companies now, not just in the tech sector, which is where the original interest really started, but across all different kinds of industries and different size of organizations. So I would just say that says something that about something's good is happening in this area, that so many companies see this as really important part of their business imperative. And some of the good practices we see, one really needs to look across the whole employment spectrum to really have a truly inclusive employment process. But some of the things we've seen on the front end are companies revamping their recruitment, selection, hiring process, interviewing processes, knowing that they've kept people out in the past. And again, I will mention having relationships with community organizations that can source talent, having portals that are affirmatively recruiting autistic individuals so that there are recruiters and hiring managers on the other end of this portal that know that this is a talent pool of neurodivergent individuals and will approach it to make it an easier on-ramp in this interview process. And that might mean from having panel interviews that are 1 or 2 days to having more one-on-one interviews, allowing sometimes candidates to come into the workplace and get a sense of what that workplace looks like, maybe ideally sharing the questions in advance so people can better prepare, and having recruiters, hiring managers really have some education about how to do this in a way that's more inclusive, changing the kinds of questions so they're less amorphous, less ambiguous, and more task-oriented, or letting people demonstrate their skills rather than have to verbally describe how they can competently do the job. All of those things are happening in progressive workplaces that really want to affirmatively recruit neurodivergent individuals.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing I've noticed over the past few years, especially in particular the last few years, are employers, this sort of invisible policy that exists. Usually the status quo is a don't ask, don't tell policy on disabilities, right? And now we're seeing, I think, less and less of that. More, like you're saying, progressive employers are wanting folks to disclose. They want to build an inclusive workforce. And how can you do that without understanding your workforce?
Absolutely.
So certainly the conversations have changed. So with that, I'd love to go over now to talking a little bit, doing a little Q&A with the audience. I know we have a couple of questions. We don't have a ton of time, but would love to start off with this question since we were on candidates. So any tips for candidates during the interview process to assess an employer's openness to accommodations upon employment without disclosing? Any thoughts on that, Susanne?
Well, I think the safest thing is to, I mentioned this, but I'll go into more elaboration, and that is look at their website. You can tell a lot just by sussing out what the employer is saying about a genuine interest in affirmatively recruiting neurodivergent individuals. And I will point you to a website that Cornell manages and populates from the U.S. Department of Labor Office of Disability Employment Policy, AskEarn, EARN.org. It's Employer Assistance Resource Network on Disability Inclusion. And there's a checklist there on things that candidates who are seeking jobs told us are things that they look for. And that is a portal that is for neurodivergent individuals, that is internships for individuals who are autistic or neurodivergent. It might be that accommodation process that we already talked about that says we accommodate, and seeing it in the DEI statement, seeing neurodivergence there. But also seeing testimonials and stories from people who are in that workplace and say, I'm thriving. This is a good place to work. I am listened to. all of those things, and ERG that has a focus on neuro. So those are signs, and there's probably a checklist. I think there's 10 or 15 items, some more broadly around disability, but these are applicable. That's a good way to get a litmus of whether or not this is a safe workplace to go in, asking immediately up front for what you need.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those are some great ways to find out. I think just the general culture of an organization before entering in and wanting to interview. I would love to just go in and maybe talk about, this might be a good segue into your course, Susanne, but just before we do that, I want to mention to the audience that the HRCI activity ID for recertification credit will be commented in the chat. So look for that number so that you can get your 1 HR general recertification credit hours towards all sorts of HR certifications. I'm not going to read all of them, but it'll be there in a second here. Susanne, you want to tell us a little bit about your course?
Sure. I talked about how important it is to think across the whole employment process. And I have this schematic. It's a little difficult to read, but I think it makes the point. Thank you very much, Kai.
Yeah, of course.
That when, we hit upon just lightly a lot of different things here. But really, if you're going to have a really successful, sustainable neurodiversity hiring program, one needs to think about it in terms of preparing that workplace, as we talked about, building a pipeline, recruiting, educating your interviewing process, onboarding people with a neurodivergent inclusive eye. So all across that employment process, one needs to think about where are places that people might get stuck, where are places that we might lose people inadvertently, and how to smooth out that process to be more inclusive of this cohort of people that are talented and want to work within the American workforce. So it needs to really be broad. And I have, and to respond to that, what I perceive, I have an online course that's a 2-week course that is asynchronous through Cornell. And I am an instructor as well as having designed the course. So I would be delighted to have more people take advantage of that. It's a very compressed way to get the big picture about all the different things to think about if you want a neurodivergent, inclusive workplace and hiring process.
Yeah, absolutely. This sounds like an amazing course. I'd love to attend as well. For those who are interested, we have a team member who just put the link in the chat. It's ecornell.cornell.edu. You'll see the link right there. Thank you for telling us about the course.
Sure.
Any final remarks as we get to the end of our session here, Susanne? Thank you for sharing everything so far, but love to hear any nuggets of truth or expertise that you've learned over the past 30 plus years of doing this work.
Well, that's a tall order. But
Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you, because it's conversations like this and dialogues and opportunities like this that will make a difference, right? We really need to open that dialogue more broadly. One of the things that got me excited about neurodiversity as an area of focus is that companies themselves have jumped on board and seen this as a talent pool, and that's very exciting. So I think I'm learning as much from them, but also I think I've heard the term, and I believe it, that people who are neurodivergent are like canaries in the coal mine, right? Because I think how we are treating this population and our success or our lack of success or our failure to accommodate, it's really going to tell us a lot about how progressive we are as companies and how successful we're going to be in getting the talent we need and being able to retain that talent and have our businesses thrive as well as individuals thrive. So it's a really, I think, great forum for us to be having these dialogues. I think it has far more generalizability than we even realize now, but I think it's why it's critically important to put it on the table and make it very, very visible in many different circles.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all of that, and we talked a lot about why it's important. First of all, the context of the US and the global workforce today, what's happening. More folks are disclosing as folks with neurodiversity. Now we know that 70+% of people with disabilities have non-apparent disabilities. So they have to disclose in order for you to know that they even have a disability. From that to then once they do disclose, we see this huge gap of support where we shared statistics on 1 in 4 neurodivergent employees are getting fired or demoted when they disclose. That's if that's true, that's also alarming as well. But then thank you for sharing us some best practices and policies today. This was really helpful. And I also want to say to the audience too, remember Disclo is here to support as well on education and training and having a standardized accommodation process that brings it to the 21st century. So we welcome any conversations any of you would like to have with me. Feel free to ping me on LinkedIn directly or our team at disclo.com. We hope this conversation was insightful for folks and inspired action at your respective organizations. So Susanne, thank you so much for taking the time today. And I really enjoyed this beautiful conversation with you.
Thank you, Kai. And thanks to everyone who joined us today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Okay. And I hope I see everybody at the next one. Bye, folks. Thanks.